Hi, everyone. My name is Andrew Paolillo, and I am the Director of Member Strategies and Solutions here at the bank. And I'm happy to have you with us today for our newest case study, where we will take a look at two of our newest advanced products, the SOFR Flipper Advance and the Callable SOFR-Indexed Floater Advance. So let's jump right into a discussion about the SOFR Flipper Advance first. So you'll see here on the page two tables outlining some of the key characteristics and features of the Advance, and we'll go through them one at a time here. So along the left-hand side, we see that the coupon structure for the Advance is floating to fixed, and the index at which it floats off of for the first portion of the Advance is going to be SOFR, the secured overnight financing rate. And the principal will be due either at maturity or sooner, and we'll get into how and why that may occur in a little bit. The member is able to prepay the advance subject to prepayment fee formulas. The key feature here to keep in mind is that the member is selling the option to the Federal Home Loan Bank of Boston to be able to put the advance before maturity, and that drives some of the value that you will see in terms of the pricing. And then in terms of the dates, there's two components. There's the maturity, and then there's the lockout period. And the lockout period is the period where the advance cannot be put back to the member. So we note how the key feature of this advance is that the member sells the option. So when we talk about more benefit or less benefit from optionality, as we see on the table on the right-hand side, because we're talking about a liability, more benefit will mean a lower rate. So what are the features that impact that rate and drive that benefit from this type of structure? So the first thing is that all else being equal, the longer the final maturity, the more benefit that you will receive from the optionality. Similarly, on the lockout period, the shorter the lockout period, the more benefit you will receive. So again, all else equal, for a structure with a 3-month lockout period as compared to a advance with a 2-year lockout period, you'd see more favorable rates on the shorter lockout. In terms of the frequency, the more often that there are opportunities for the advance to be put back, so i.e. quarterly, you will see more benefit versus when the frequency is less often, such as just a one-time option. And then lastly, in terms of interest rate volatility, as market volatility is higher, then that is going to lead to more benefit coming from having the embedded option and selling the embedded option. So the last thing to point out on the structure is when, for the first part of the advance, when it's in the lockout period, remember, it will be a floating rate subject to daily SOFR, the secured overnight financing rate. But the advance will be priced at a negative spread to SOFR, and that spread can be customized as well. So right now, SOFR is at 5 basis points, so an indicative structure might be SOFR minus 5 basis points. If the Fed hikes rates as they're expected to do and SOFR goes to 75 basis points, then the rate you would be paying would then be 70 basis points. SOFR at 75 minus the 5. As we see interest rates, short-term interest rates start to move higher, then there is the potential for more flexibility in tailoring those structures to say SOFR minus 25, SOFR minus 50, as opposed to where we are today in such close proximity to 0. So here we have some recent pricing indications to give you a feel for what a SOFR flipper structure may look like. So the way it's denoted is the first the maturity of the advance, and then after that the lockout period. So for that first example, you can see a 3-year 6-month structure would mean a 3-year final maturity with a lockout period of 6 months. And all of these are assumed in this instance to be puttable on a quarterly basis. The spread to SOFR is going to be minus 5 basis points, as we just talked about on the last spread. So that will give us a starting floating rate of 0%. So in the first, in the case of the first advance listed there, the 3-year 6-month, it's going to float at SOFR minus 5, which is today at 0. But as interest rates move higher, you'll be paying a rate below SOFR. And then if the advance is not put back after the end of the lockout period, the coupon convention will flip from a floating rate to a fixed rate. And you can see in that first instance, the rate that you'd be paying for the last 2.5 years, potentially, would be 140. Now you can see on the table on the chart on the bottom, relative to other short-term instruments, such as the daily cash manager or 1-month classic advances, or even products like what you're receiving on interest reserves or 1-month treasury bills, you can see that the day one rate on the SOFR flipper advance is lower than pretty much everything else on the board. So we've mentioned briefly about how the advance works, but here's a little bit of a visual to make it a little clearer in terms of the two different parts of the advance, right? Remember, it's floating to fixed. So what that means is during the lockout period, it's going to float at a negative spread to SOFR, and the advance cannot be put back. When you get to that first put date, the likelihood of the advance being put or not will be dependent on where interest rates are and where market volatility are at that point in time. Now, generally speaking, you can say that if rates are to move higher, there's going to be a greater likelihood that the advance will be canceled and funding will have to be replaced. If rates go down, there's a greater likelihood that the advance will not be canceled immediately and that it will flip from the floating rate to the fixed rate at that time. And it's important to note, we talked about the put frequency. So many times the structure has quarterly puts. So even if the advance flips to the fixed rate, depending on what happens with rates and volatility from that point forward, it may well be put in advance of the final maturity. So the SOFR flipper is a unique advance with a differentiated structure relative to other funding choices out there. So there's a couple practical ways that members can put the flipper to work. So the first one is to be opportunistic when market conditions are adjusting in such a way that it does prevent some opportunities. So when the yield curve is flattening and when interest rate volatility is high, then the SOFR flipper explicitly takes advantage of that in terms of producing lower rates on funding costs. And that ability to reduce funding costs has an awful lot of value at all times, but especially now, given where we are in the interest rate cycle. So for those depositories, as short-term rates begin to rise and maintaining discipline on deposit pricing, as we begin to consider marginal cost of funds analysis, then the flipper can be a useful way to keep interest expense low without having to ratchet up deposit rates. And the last thing worth pointing out here is in terms of managing interest rate risk. So the flipper can be particularly beneficial for asset-sensitive members who see their earnings profile of the institution improve dramatically as rates go higher. And the bigger risk to the earnings and capital stream is that rates remain unchanged or even go down. So if you think that in recent months that the Fed has swung too hawkish, too fast, right, in terms of pricing in 7 or 8 rate hikes for 2022 into what is being implied by the yield curve. If you think ultimately that the risk that you want to hedge against is that we're not going to see nearly that amount of hikes, then putting on shorter liabilities with negative spread to a short-term rate like SOFR is certainly one way to capitalize on that. Now let's switch over to talking about the Callable SOFR-Indexed floater advance. So this advance is very similar to the SOFR-Indexed advance that we have had for a number of years now, with one slight difference that we'll get into momentarily here. So it is a true floating rate advance. And again, the index is going to be SOFR, the secured overnight financing rate. And the principal is due either at maturity or sooner at the specified cancellation dates. And different than the SOFR flipper advance, which we just discussed, the member owns the option. So they have the ability to prepay the advance on those specified cancellation dates. Now, on those specified cancellation dates, there's no fee to prepay the advance. The member does have the flexibility to prepay the advance outside of one of those dates, and there it will be subject to a fee at that time. And then maturities are available all the way out to 20 years. So here we're looking at our short-term advance curve. In green is the fixed rate classic advance curve. And then we've noted below that two indicative structures for the Callable SOFR-Indexed floater advance. So shorter on the curve in light blue there is a 7-month, 6-month structure. So that means a 7-month final maturity where there is a one-time call option for the member to call the advance at their discretion at the 6-month mark. The other structure further to the right is a 13-month / 12-month advance. So again, that's going to be 13-month maturity with the member option at the 12-month mark to call the advance if they want to. So you can see, because of the expectation that the Fed will be hiking rates in 2022, the yield curve is positively sloped, and you have longer-term fixed rates much higher than where short-term rates are. So when we think about a floating rate advance product where the index is a daily reset rate, so SOFR is at 5 basis points right now. The fact that the Fed may be considering rate hikes in the coming weeks and months, SOFR is not going to move higher until the actual day that it does, because it is a daily resetting rate. So it provides some opportunity for those members who are asset sensitive or inclined to think, as we spoke about previously, that rate hikes may not be coming at the pace and magnitude that is currently being baked into the expectations. That would provide some value and flexibility to minimize funding cost. So there's a number of ways in which a floating rate liability, such as the Callable SOFR-Indexed floater advance, can provide value to the overall balance sheet management process. So the first thing that jumps off the page is, consider when you take a fixed rate borrowing, such as the classic advance, which many are familiar with. You take a 12-month maturity, and you're getting 12 months of liquidity risk protection as well as 12 months of interest rate risk protection. Now, that may meet your needs, it may not meet your needs. Maybe your balance sheet is in need of longer-term liquidity protection, but your interest rate exposure is such that you need and want to be exposed to the short end of the yield curve. That for you, mitigating risk at an overall balance sheet level means having a liability pegged to the front end of the yield curve. So the Callable SOFR-Indexed floater advance provides you that opportunity to separate out liquidity risk and interest rate risk And if your needs are different for those two different types of risks, then you can create the exposure that is most complementary to your unique balance sheet. And then the second part that jumps out is having that flexibility to prepay the advance at predetermined dates ahead of the maturity, right? So maybe you initially sought out the callable SOFR index floater advance because of that ability to get longer liquidity protection, but keep our interest rate exposure short. Well, as time passes and the yield curve changes around and asset prepayments change and asset loan growth or investment opportunities become more or less attractive, then having the flexibility to collapse the funding and either replace it with deposits or move to a different structure or a different part of the yield curve with wholesale. You might consider, if you have the callable SOFR index floater advance, rates start to rise, and now all of a sudden the yield curve is flat, and you can do a SOFR flipper with a SOFR minus 75 basis point rate that gets you down to a near zero cost of funds. That may be most advantageous. So having the flexibility of that option in your hands to be able to prepay the advance early can have supreme value to the member. So this brings us to the end of our product primers for our two new products. Thank you for joining us today. If you have any questions at all, would like to talk through any of the details or any ways that they can be implemented strategically, please feel free to reach out to me. My contact information is there. In addition, the member funding desk is always at the ready to answer any questions, and of course, your relationship manager is as well. So with that, we'll wrap things up. Thank you for your time, and hope everyone has a great day. Thank you. Bye.